Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, welcome to the Early Childhood Seminar Series. We'll begin our time together with karakia. Me enoi tātou. Kia hora te marino, kia whakapapa ponamu te moana, hei huarahi mā tātou I te rangi nei. Aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation by retired Professor Lyndall Mitchell from the University of Waikato. In this very timely and relevant presentation, Linda will be sharing with us some possibilities for transformative change in early childhood education systems in a world of converging crises. If any questions arise for you during the presentation that you would like to ask Linda, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and she will respond to them at the end of her presentation. You can also use the chat function throughout the presentation to connect with each other and the panelists. After the seminar, a recording will be available on our Early Childhood Seminar Series YouTube channel. I will now pass over to Dr. Kiri Gould to welcome and introduce Linda Mitchell. Kia ora, Kiri.
Kia ora, Justine. Tēnā koutou katoa. It is my great pleasure to introduce Linda Mitchell to you. I'm sure that you already know who Linda Mitchell is, but for those of you who need a reminder, Linda has been a really long-term advocate and key voice in early childhood in Aotearoa for many years, and her roles are many. She's been a key figure in the union movement in early childhood. She's been a senior researcher for NZEI and has been a key voice in terms of advocating, analysing and critiquing early childhood policy, and has been a key figure in designing and contributing to some of our best early childhood policies too. And she's a really strong voice and critic for early childhood. So I came to Linda's work through her critique of the commodification and privatisation of early childhood, but she also has really strong interests in other policy areas and in the and democratic early childhood systems and pedagogies too. So she has a wide range of interests and is a significant figure in the early childhood landscape. We invited Linda to the Early Childhood Seminar Series because we feel like we're in a really critical time in early childhood at the moment. And globally and locally, narratives around early childhood have moved from traditionally what we might think of as, important to the sector. And with the current government specifically, I think there's a real danger of undoing some of the gains that we've made. And so who better to invite to talk to us about these things than someone who is so experienced in advocacy for the sector. And so I'm really interested in what Linda has to say about policy and advocacy in this current moment in time. And it's my pleasure to hand you over to Linda to speak. Welcome, Linda.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to duck out of frame now.
Okay. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki a koutou. Kia ora, Justine, mō tō karakia. Thank you very much, Kiri, for inviting me to this series. I'm really pleased to be talking here because I do think this is a critical time for early childhood, and the more that we can work together, the stronger we will be. And so Kiri, as she said, asked me to talk about policy and advocacy and really to go back a little bit over some of the past advocacy that happened. And I'm going to talk particularly about what we did when I was a union leader during the 1980s and 1990s, and a researcher and academic since then. And I want to pay tribute to the women I worked with in the union movement. They were amazing, inspirational, bold, imaginative women. They had expansive views about the purposes of early childhood education. They were very staunch. It was a public good. It was the right of children, and also the importance and worth of qualified, equitably paid, professionally supported teachers, kaiako, in a sector that was and still is undervalued. And so my work in research with NZCER and as an academic at the University of Waikato has had both a policy and pedagogy focus. And I've written as a critic and I've written as a very strong supporter. I think we've had spectacular successes. We've had crushing disappointments along the way, and we're at a time of enormous danger and challenge as this government is trying to unravel gains that have been decades in the making. And I guess the context of converging global crises referred to in my abstract and the consequences of neoliberalism make it really important to aim for transformative change, not just tinkering around at the edges. So quickly, this is the structure of my presentation, what I'll talk about. I'll start by talking briefly about the premises underpinning views of early childhood and my belief in early childhood as a public good and a child's right. And then I want to talk about two examples where sustained and collective advocacy brought about systemic change. One was pay parity with school teachers, only partially realised, and is it in jeopardy? Possibly. And the second was a community-based early childhood sector report called Future Directions, and a government strategic plan that came directly from the work we did on that. And I want to then move to the early childhood regulatory review recommendations and advocacy that I know is happening now, and hope that people will be impelled to take on more, and to end with a message of hope. So I think it's really important to think about what are the purposes of education. It's a question that needs to be asked, taking account the context of our time. And I'm talking about the threat of pandemics, the wars, the environmental threats, the extremes of poverty and wealth, the inequities, and in New Zealand, current threats to tiriti or waitangi. And the quotes on the PowerPoint are from Michael Fielding and Peter Moss, who wrote a book in 2011, and Helen May, asserting early childhood as a public good, and with very powerful images of children and adults. Yet despite this question being so singularly important, there's been very little public discussion about what early childhood education should be for. Instead, current government debates in our country are still captured by a predominant view of early childhood as an economic benefit, as childcare for working families. And I notice that is coming back into the language a lot more now. And policy that privileges markets over state action and individualism over the common good. So that I see as the end result of neoliberalism. Commodification and privatisation conceptualise early childhood as businesses, parents and children as consumers, and they prioritise financial values that's incompatible with the aim of early childhood as a public good. So my last premise, I guess, is that there's unfinished business. There's a lot of unfinished business in early childhood systems, but transformation is possible. So I'm going to whip back to the 1990s, and it's remarkable how similar in some ways the context is for now. And the first example I want to talk about is the kindergarten funding and pay parity campaign of the 1990s. But the struggle over pay and valuing of teachers in kindergartens and in education and care centres has started long before then. And I always remember Wendy Lee talking about the 1970s, maybe 1974, when kindergarten teachers in their first year of teaching were actually paid less than what kindergarten students in the training colleges were then being paid, because they had an allowance for kindergarten teachers. So what I want to say is the work that we did is on the shoulders of other women. So at that time, a new national government was elected at the end of 1990. Immediately, the Employment Equity Act was thrown out. There was an economic and social initiative statement, and Jim Bolger was the Prime Minister. I've got a quote here from him: "Short-term sacrifices and some longer-term adjustments are both necessary if we are to succeed in the battle for economic growth and the return to full employment. Everyone knows we have to adjust. My aim is that everyone plays their part in this process." So that was happening on the wider context. Within early childhood centres in the sector, early childhood funding was basically frozen. There was a halt to increases in funding. There were cuts to funding for under 2-year-olds. There were moves to privatise kindergartens. So up until then, fees, there was a regulation prohibiting fees from being payable in kindergartens. They were free. Fees became able to be charged. Teacher registration became voluntary. There was a gross underfunding. The Employment Contracts Act 1991 was very anti-union. It encouraged individual and site bargaining. And I think those photos you can see there are demonstrations about the Employment Contracts Act. And then kindergartens which had been paid directly by the state for kindergarten salaries, were bulk funded in 1992. An immediate reaction from the union was to demonstrate against the cost-cutting agenda and the early childhood funding shortcomings. And I put that picture up there. Those are teacher members in Cuba Mall in Wellington. And they had imaginative and snappy political songs that actually captured the interest and attention of the public. It really appealed to people. That's how they got their message across. So that was the context in which we felt we really needed to be strategic. We knew we needed to address the inadequate funding levels in order to settle the collective employment contract, and that will be the first step to achieving pay parity. And at that time, we had amalgamated with NZEI Te Riu Roa, really as a force of opposition against all of the terrible things that were happening to unions and to workers in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And for this campaign, we actually worked with NZFKU, which is was the umbrella organisation for kindergarten associations. So slightly unusual, employers and unions working together. We had the same goal. So the funding campaign, it was planned by our national executive and officials. I was an official, along with Claire Wells, who people may know. It was then discussed in branch meetings, so it was a very democratic kind of discussion. The actions were decided nationally, but then they were taken up locally and given a very local flavour. And nationally, we put out a lot of information. We went to meetings, we had fact sheets, we had information to support people in lobbying. And one of the tactics that was incredibly successful was to write a petition calling for increased funding and the reasons why we needed that. But instead of presenting it as a single petition with, so many thousand signatures, when we'd collected them all, we asked each region or each branch of the union to gather signatures from their local families and their employers. So they needed to talk to people to get the signatures. and then to organise for a group of them to meet with their local MPs to discuss the issues. And the local MP was then obliged to stand up in the House of Parliament and read out the petition. And in this way, 263 identical petitions were read in Parliament. So the politicians were getting a bit sick of hearing about it. But what that happened from that was a special hearing of the Education and Science Select Committee about kindergarten funding. And against the odds, they recommended favourable attention to kindergarten funding. And that was in that really hard context. So we settled the collective employment contract agreement. The government funded the pay increase. And what was really important was we agreed on an independent job evaluation. It wasn't the end of the story, however. There was an enormous backlash from the government. It was very harsh. And what it did was it used urgency, which is what it's done just currently with the pay equity bill, to remove kindergartens from the state sector. And Jenny Shipley was then Prime Minister. She gave the rationale, and I'm just going to read it. In the past, because of State Services Commission involvement, the negotiations have been used by the NZEI to secure additional funding for kindergarten associations over and above that allocated to early childhood through the budget process. This is an avenue to secure funding for wage increases that is simply not available to other early childhood providers. The government is not prepared to allow this inequity to continue in the forthcoming contract negotiations. So instead of saying, oh, we'll fix the inequity by bringing other people up to the same, they wanted to cut kindergartens down to size. And that picture there is, we were an incredibly political union and group of members who were very well informed. And I want to say that I think teachers are in a very good position if they have the support to talk to parents who are wonderful advocates for early childhood education and for children. And they want the best for their children. So these teachers had used them. Anyway, we got on the telephone tree. We rang all the Wellington, this is National Office, rang all the Wellington teachers on their telephone tree, and they came down to Parliament and they sat in the gallery during the hearing of the State Sector Amendment Bill. And there was a little bit of disruption. Some were asked to leave the gallery. You can see angry teachers arriving. And they also spoke to reporters. And some of those people I know are still around. We cried when it went through. We felt so strongly. So what happened was that removal from the state sector cut kindergartens adrift from government responsibility. Kindergarten associations then faced the complex and costly business of negotiating. And we had a single national collective employment contract. It splintered into 18 contracts, which we tried to keep identical. I think that's a really important lesson, the importance of state involvement. But we did have the job evaluation. And that happened in 1999. It was a woman called Janice Burns, who was an independent consultant. It was funded by NZEI, the Union Te Riu Roa, and the kindergarten associations jointly. So that power of us working together. And just to say, in 1999, experienced registered teachers with a degree in education and care centres earned 52% less than primary school teachers, similarly qualified, and kindergarten teachers 46% less. And for education and care in the childcare centres, it was often a lot less, a huge differential. So the case for pay parity is different from pay equity. It uses internal comparisons with the largely female primary teacher workforce. And that was the conclusion written up there. I don't need to read that out, but basically it was that the job size is the same. There's no justification for differences in salary. So we still needed to wait for a new government, and that came at the end of 1999 with the Helen Clark-led government. It was elected. And because of the work that had been done and because of the politicking that we'd done, the Labour Party was very aware of the issues and what needed to happen. Kindergartens, and we also had a Minister of Education, Trevor Mallard, who was very supportive of the early childhood sector. And my colleague Claire Wells went and worked with Trevor as a political advisor. So these things were coming together somewhat. Kindergartens were reinstated to the State Sector Act. Pay parity was agreed on the 1st of July 2002, implemented over 3 years. Really significant that the Secretary for Education is a party for the agreement. And you can see on the PowerPoint there was still media commentary, you know, belittling the worst of early childhood teachers. How's the time going?
You're fine.
So
Yeah.
have I got another story?
Yep.
Okay, so the next story is a different story. It's a union initiative again, but it's about a broader policy issue. And it is more around the rights of young children and families to access high quality, good early childhood services. We were sick to death of top-down reviews that had weakened qualification requirements over the 1990s, that was supporting a very targeted approach to funding rather than universal funding. That paid lip service to consultation. We decided we'll do our own review and we'll get other people to listen to us. And we had very strong connections with other early childhood national organisations. So we, 7 organisations collaborated with us on this review, and formed the project team. The chair was Geraldine MacDonald, who some of you may know, who was a long-term wonderful advocate for early childhood. And Claire Wells and I formed the secretariat. And you can see the terms of reference up there. They were to provide a rigorous, coherent review, etc. But we wanted to recognise the diversity of organisation cultures. So we had play centre and kohanga reo and education and care and kindergarten and home-based all on the panel. We wanted to contribute to a comprehensive policy for Māori education. And we also wanted to put government agencies under scrutiny. We had huge consultations through each of our organisation networks. We wrote an interim report and then we called for written submissions, and actually the government agencies did write submissions. So we came up with some long-term goals, some big picture goals, and a lot of recommendations. One long-term goal was universal funding on a basis equitable with schools, policy to be developed in partnership, and the government to develop a strategic plan for early childhood with wider holistic support for families. And we launched the report in the Beehive. Spokespeople from all the major political parties were invited to respond. And there you can see responses of Helen Clark, who was leader of the opposition in 1996, and Bill English, who was Minister of Education. Very different. I'm not going to go into the story. In fact, in the references, you will see that Claire actually has written the story of the campaign, which had some similarity to the funding campaign. And the policy proposals did go to the Education and Science Select Committee, where there were very contrasting responses to the proposal. You can see the Ministry of Education didn't think it was necessary or appropriate to develop a strategic plan, but Labor said, yes, it would certainly do that. And that indeed is what happened. So I think that Pathways to the Future, Ngā Huarahi Arataki, is directly attributable to the Future Directions report. And it was quite an aspirational plan, I think more so than the one that we've had more recently. And it was framed around goals about children's participation in quality early childhood, about improving collaborative relationships between early childhood and community services and parents and families and schools and so on, and about improving quality. That was so important. And there were actions that were to be addressed. And I just want to point to this one. These were the initiatives to support quality early childhood education. And I've highlighted the one that is now contentious and that we need to fight to safeguard. Teacher registration targets were set to increase the employment of registered teachers to 100% by the year 2012, and incentives were offered to make sure that that could happen. So that is really important. Now, there's huge debate going on at the time, which is very similar to what is happening now. So the academics, researchers, a lot of the early childhood organisations was seeing qualifications as so important. Early Childhood Council was doom and gloom. Hundreds of early childhood teachers will be forced out. Hundreds of preschools will close, that kind of thing. And I must say, the Early Childhood Council and its forerunners, representing a lot of for-profit early childhood centres, have often been the negative voice in the policy debates. And that divisive debate we're here now. Here are the incentives that were offered. You can see that, I mean, quite far-reaching, higher funding rates if you got more qualified teachers, with scholarships, with study grants, relocation, returning to teacher allowances, resource from the Teaching Council, recruitment brokers. And at the same time, we were making progress towards pay parity. And I did an evaluation of the strategic plan over from 2004 to 2009. I looked at national changes and I looked at some centre changes. And what you can see there is a huge increase in the percentage of qualified teachers from 2004, 37%, to 2009, short period of time, 64%. And then it's kind of dribbled along till 2024 because we haven't had those that encouragement that we need. So we now turn to today, and this is commentary and a photo from Newsroom by a journalist, Emma Hatton, which was written in March 2024 when the Early Childhood Education Regulatory Review was first announced. And people probably know all of this. It was the first sector to be regulated or to have a review. The work was to begin in June 24 and to be finished by December, and that will be followed by a funding review. So David Seymour, who is Minister for Regulations and Associate Minister of Education, Early Childhood portfolio, he claimed from the beginning to have a huge amount of feedback that regulations imposed a lot of restriction and they make it harder to focus on kids. That's what he said here. And from the start, a lot of us questioned who that feedback had come from. Sure, there were things that needed to change in the regulation, but they were not some of the major important regulations that have now been recommended for change. So it was certainly didn't get the feedback from academics and researchers. That's the world I'm in now. And we know that submissions were called for. The Ministry for Regulations received 2,300 written submissions. They held discussion with various groups. And I just had a quick read of the summary report before I did this. And I thought, how come the recommendations that were made came out from that process? Because what it said was many submitters said that children's best interests needed to be at the centre and the primary consideration of the review. I'm quoting from their report. Many submitters said that ECE should be a public good and fully funded and provided by the government, and or that profit should not be able to be made from children's education. Some submitters said it was imperative for the sector to have a strong understanding of their obligations under Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Many submitters were concerned about deregulation. Many said the proportion of qualified teachers needs to be higher and ratios and group sizes needed to be better. So it was a shock to receive the regulatory review report and its recommendations just a few days before the Christmas holiday break, when we were flat out, really. And the recommendations that are distinctly oppositional to these ideas and that decades of research have found to be crucial. So there wasn't any consultation with a wider group on the recommendations from the ECE regulatory review report. They were there for the submissions, but it was only a small group of people who were consulted at the end. So these have been agreed by the Cabinet at the end of March. So I've been working with a group of professors and senior academics from different universities. We got together in rather a hurry and probably could have had a bigger group, but times were urgent. And because we were so appalled and so critical of some of the crucial recommendations, not all of them. We wrote an open letter and background paper. We sent it to all cabinet ministers and opposition spokespeople, particularly focused on those issues listed in the PowerPoint. So first of all, we argued early childhood as a public good, like schools, shouldn't be treated as a free commercialised industry. And we pointed out it was a very research-based background paper, so we backed up everything we said with research evidence, and a lot of it from New Zealand as well as international. A free market approach to provision and choice has been a spectacular failure. For years we've had that. We've had oversupply and undersupply. We need early childhood provision to be planned. Government is subsidising for-profit publicly listed companies who have little accountability except to their shareholders. Fees charged are variable. The Ministry of Education doesn't even know what fees are charged. We could look at what other countries are doing, and that's what we said in the submission. The purpose of regulations currently is very broad, and it makes a very important reference to Te Tiriti o Waitangi. It doesn't need changing. Licensing criteria, they're important for accountability to community and government, and some of those we picked out were particularly linked to curriculum standards. And they address the nature of interactions children should experience, the kind of how we should support children's cultures and identities and so on, and really important principles that make sure that the children's interests are protected. So removing those would provide little or no accountability to quality if they go into a guidance document or something. And then highly problematic is the proposal to allow greater flexibility in workforce qualifications. And they say particularly for services in rural and low socioeconomic communities, Māori and Pacifica services and home-based services. And I'm just going to read from the background paper. By proposing a shift away from qualified staff, the review goes against 40 years of research evidence across multiple jurisdictions that identifies qualified staff as one of 3 policy variables, together with appropriate adult-child ratios by age and group size that form the iron triangle of quality. The variables impact both adult and child behaviour with fewer positive interactions, less advancement in development associated with lower staff qualifications and larger group sizes. I'll just get a drink of water. So it says it's trying to fix a problem of cost to parents and shortage of teachers. And what they could do well, and what we recommended, is that they look at what has already worked very well. If you look at the Pathways to the Future initiatives that worked in raising the number of qualified teachers. And if we look at cost, we can look widely at what happens internationally, where there's a cap on the amount you can charge in fees, where there's accountability to the early childhood community, where salaries paid to management have to be justified, any profits are made, where does that come from? Parent fees, funding. So a lot is happening. So that is what I've been doing and mainly working on. And we've had some media coverage. Alex Gunn and Carmen Daly have been spokespeople for this particular background paper. I know that NZEI Te Riu Roa has had a petition that has been presented. I know that early childhood organisations have had various forums and are working together. And so, are we all right?
5 minutes, yeah.
How long?
5 more minutes?
5 minutes, that's all right. And then the next outrage is the Pay Equity Amendment Bill, passed under urgency. That's what happens. It's so undemocratic. The government wasn't elected to pass this legislation. Nobody knew it was coming up. It was not what we voted for, and it hits female-dominated workforces. And a common thread you can see in legislative repeals and also the Treaty of Waitangi Principles Bill is to remove recognition of the unique status and rights of Māori as tangata whenua. I don't know if people have looked at the Regulatory Standards Bill proposal that has gone through Cabinet, and they're now going to make it into a bill that is similar. It favours individual liberties, private property, business interests, minimises collective interests. It explicitly excludes references to the Treaty Te Tiriti. So it undermines our constitutional foundation. And it promotes this idea that everyone has to be treated equally, exactly the same. It also gives excessive powers to the Minister for Regulation. 88% of submissions didn't support what was in that proposal, and yet it's gone through Cabinet. So I'm going to end now just on a book that I've recently published with Peter Moss, and it's available open access from UCL Press. We compared 7 high-income countries in the Anglosphere, including Aotearoa, New Zealand, and we also looked at Sweden and France. We were looking at systemic failings in neoliberal countries. And to my shame, I've held early childhood in New Zealand up as an exemplar of because in lots of ways at that time, written before these horrendous things, we were on a very good trajectory. So we made a case against the Anglosphere model, and particularly the increasing reliance on marketisation and privatisation, the growing presence of for-profit providers, commodification, the confined way of thinking about early childhood, split systems of care and education. And we argued that transformation is critical. It can't happen overnight. We need to look at early childhood as a system, not just early childhood centres. So we also looked at paid parental leave. We argued that it means working on image of the child, and Te Whareki has got a good aspiration for children. Parents not as consumers, but as active collaborators, teachers, workers, image of the rich pedagogue, as a democratic professional, as a curious person who works collaboratively, who welcomes diversity, who's critical. And the early childhood service as a public good, a public resource, as a universal and basic public service. So we gave priority to an integrated and public early childhood system, services conceptualised as education rather than care, daycare, although the education is infused with care. A graduate workforce of early childhood teachers having parity with those of schools, a universal multi-purpose form of early childhood service, so an integrated centre, and synergy between paid parental leave, which should be paid well paid, and children's entitlement to free early childhood education. So hopefully that has given some ideas about having images, visions, analysis, strategies to get there, going across boundaries for support. Oh, just one last thing, one last message. Sorry. This is a saying which came from a 1968 student revolution in Paris, and that Helen Penn introduced me to, and it says, be realistic, demand the impossible. So that's what I think we need to do.
I love that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I just opened the chat to see what comments and questions people had, and now I've covered the camera so I can't see. Oh yeah, there we go. Thank you so much, Linda. I have many thoughts and feelings actually listening to you talk. And I think it's really good for the sector to think about, to actually hear these stories of successful advocacy in the past, and to notice the parallels between what happened,
Yes,
and not just in the rhetoric and discourse, but in the actual actions of politicians and those advocating for the sector. Because I think that gives us some real strategies moving forward too. So a couple of things. One thing that you said that really caught my attention was when you were explaining the strategies from the 90s that worked, and the variety of strategies that you use for advocacy. And you talked about, you know, the combination of those strategies creating a force of opposition. And that phrase really stuck with me. And I was also thinking about how what you described is a real force of cooperation across the sector too. And that is maybe a real lesson that we can reflect on as we come into this time when we really do need to show a force of opposition about some of these kind of policies that are happening, and how we might be able to cooperate better across what is now quite a diverse and splintered sector. Yeah. So what do you know, what advice could you give?
I think we are starting to come together more, but I think when that first report came out, we were quite divided. I think what I want to get across is we need to have an idea of what we want.
Mm.
We don't just complain about what we don't want, but we do that as well, if you know what I mean. And I did have a quote here that Peter Moss has used. It actually comes from Friedman, but it is, be ready for when the politically impossible becomes the politically inevitable. So, and it's a bit like, think some of what we did, you know, wasn't having an immediate impact, but it was there waiting in the background to be popped up when it was the right time.
I'm just looking at some of the questions and comments from the from the audience, and there's some commentary around how we might better get uptake from the news media in terms of challenging the current review to the regulations.
Oh yeah, and I wonder if that's how good we are at forming relationships with the media. I don't know. I mean, I think our open letter and background paper, we were kind of thinking we'd be like the King's Council who wrote on Te Tiriti o Waitangi principles bill, and we were these people in the early childhood sector, but it didn't have the same traction. I know Alex got interviewed by Radio New Zealand, but somehow perhaps we need a communications person working with us a bit. I don't know.
It's interesting because actually there's opportunity to echo these things through social media, but whether it just becomes an echo chamber to the people who are already, convinced, I'm not sure.
The other thing is that I have done is written opinion pieces, and I've had 2 published, and I've also written a letter to the editor, but you have to be quite quick to do that, you know, to make it timely. But I think they can, and you see, I don't know social media and all that. I'm from a different age, so I'm sure that it is a powerful forum as well. I don't know what it does really.
It can be, and it can also be just a place where nothing much happens. I like this question from Juan, which is, when the current government chooses to overlook more than 40 years of research, how can we as early childhood education researchers continue to advocate effectively for research-informed policy and practice?
What do you think?
It's an interesting one, isn't it? I was in a meeting the other night where we were talking about advocacy in relation to the regulations bill, and feeling frustrated that the government doesn't seem to care about research or scholarship backing up their policies anymore. And I felt like maybe the real force of opposition needs to come from actually early childhood centre owners and teachers, because they are the ones, and parents. Yeah, I liked how you said that, because they are the ones that maybe will get more traction in terms of listening. But to answer Juan's question, is it about making research? Maybe it is about accessing those channels like the conversation and editorial pieces, and that make research publicly available.
And writing in a way that is easy to, not full of jargon, is quite important, I think.
Yes.
But, you know, one of the thoughts Peter Moss is saying to me, is there anything I can do? Because we kind of worked on this book and we've held up New Zealand, and I'm thinking there may be, but not quite yet, but there may be, when whatever comes out, that we could get some international, highly esteemed people like him also to come into the debate. Might be an idea. I just think we keep going, we keep researching, we keep saying it, and we think this may be a one-term government, you know, the way they're heading.
I did love your picture of David Seymour on the horse. I laughed out loud. Yeah. DT asks an interesting question about the seduction of for-profit providers and what they offer teachers.
Yes.
What do you think?
I don't know. I kind of think when they get there, they might get a bit of a shock, mightn't they?
Actually, as you were talking, I had a question similar to this one, or in the same vein as Deeti's question, which is about how can, as teacher education providers, how can we encourage teachers to take up this identity as an advocate?
Yes.
And how can we embed in them a clear vision of what early childhood is
Yes.
that is different from what they're seeing in the sector? Because, yeah, I feel like teachers go out into the sector and see and are exposed to a whole lot of different narratives about what a good teacher is and what teaching practice should look like. And, you know, and that diminishes their role as advocates and even actively discourages it sometimes. So that's a question for, I think, teacher education providers, but also the sector as a whole. How can we keep upholding this idea that professionalism includes having a voice and
Yes.
advocacy?
I think the other thing is, I mean, I've worked with some wonderful early childhood centres, teachers on TLRI projects and Centre of Innovation projects, teachers as researchers. Incredible work and an incredible partnership approach that we had in that work, and getting that out there is quite important. So I don't know why people might be seduced by the for-profit sector, but unless it's that they're overwhelmed by workload, and perhaps what's their qualification? Are they qualified teachers? Do they know possibilities? I don't know. Okay. Oh yeah, more PD on advocacy. Are there any more?
Yeah. No, I think that's it. Are there any, there might be just a
I
few
think
more.
there was one from Kirsty, who's from the union, further back.
Up quite a bit further.
Kirsty, there. Oh, she's just commenting. But Kirsty works for NZEI Te Riu Roa, and so I'm glad you're here, Kirsty. I'm sure you've heard these stories before.
Yeah. I mean, and that is another issue that feeds into this, which is the rise of individual contracts and the
and slagging of the union.
Yeah.
You know, I listened to Seymour talking at a media conference after the report was released, and he was, you know, bad-mouthing the union and basically implying that the opposition just came from people who were self-interested, which is, as you can see, it's not about that.
Fantastic conversation. Thank you. And it's so nice to be able to get to sit next to you.
I'm so pleased to be here. It was my terror of using the IT. I said, Kitty, can I come to your office, please?
Yeah. I think there's lots more themes and strands we could talk about. You talked about some kind of anti-democratic government processes and the, you know, the real importance of holding on to democratic practices and values in early childhood. And so we almost need another seminar series to talk about that theme, but I can see Justine's popping up there. So
yeah, ready to close. Thank you, everybody, for your comments.
Wow, kia ora koutou. And I certainly wasn't trying to hurry you on at all. I would very happily listen to much, much more of this. But kia ora kiri, and thank you, Linda, for your presentation today. It's a really timely reminder that when we may be feeling a bit overwhelmed by the convergence of crises, that we have already experienced times when sustained and collective advocacy have produced systemic change in early childhood education policy in Aotearoa, and it can happen again. So we hope this seminar is going to be a catalyst for our audience to engage in ongoing conversations about issues currently facing the early childhood sector, and perhaps prompt some further discussion of the advocacy roles that people might play and provide some hopefulness for transformative change. So ngā mihi nui ki a koe, Linda. We're very appreciative of your time and for your sharing of your experience and wisdom, and for all that you have done for the early childhood sector in your career thus far, with more to come, I'm sure. To our early childhood seminar series audience, if you wish to share or revisit this very important presentation, please check out our early childhood seminar series YouTube channel. The recording of this seminar will be available in a couple of days, and we look forward to seeing you all back for our next seminar in June. So keep an eye on your inbox for the flyer and registration information, which will be with you in a couple of days. Thank you again for joining us today. We'll close with karakia. Nui noi tātou. Kia tau te rangi Mārie o te rangi e tu iho nei, o papatuanuku i tākoto nei, o te tai ao i awhi nei, ki runga i a tātou, tihei mauri ora. May the peace of the sky above, of the earth below, of the all-embracing universe rest upon us all. Behold, it is life. Take good care, everyone. Ka kite anō.